Video games are great. I love them, you love them. Thanks to Nintendo a few years ago, your nan now loves them. They've taken over the world, and that's because they're just a lot of fun. Well, most of the time. Occasionally, developers get things so wrong it's embarrassing, and the mess left is mentally hard to forget about. Unfortunately, wrestling games seem to have a knack for being beyond terrible every now and then. Totally forgetting that a game is meant to be entertaining, these abominations will make you want to physically cry. They're that bad. I'm Simon from What Culture, and this is the 10 worst wrestling video games ever. Number 10. Backyard Wrestling and Backyard Wrestling 2. If the games themselves weren't bad enough, both Backyard Wrestling titles also had awful subtitles. Don't try this at home, and there goes the neighborhood. It was painfully obvious the demographic developer Paradox was going for. One of the negatives about the pro wrestling boom was people who had no clue about the industry trying to get a piece of the pie. And this was still the case in 2003 when the original of these was released. With characters that floated around like they were in the air and blood splattering across the screen no matter what move you hit, it was just a substandard fighting game with the idea of wrestling shoehorned into the mix. And the wrestlers didn't have shadows, so they looked as if they were completely separate from the environment. It was shit. Number 9. WWF in your house. You know the problem with trends? People jump on the back of them even when they really shouldn't. In 1996, Mortal Kombat was all the rage, so guess who had to suffer? Wrestling fans. WWF in your house was horrendously guilty of this. It was awful because of it. Going for that weird digitized look, which was bad enough, because the game looks disgusting, developer Sculptured Software also decided wrestling wasn't enough, so they gamed the whole thing up. For example, the British Bulldog threw British flags at his opponents, whereas the Undertaker could summon actual ghosts. It didn't even let you pin people properly. The words "pin him" just flashed up on screen when it was time to end the match. Utter garbage. Number 8. WWE Aftershock. Do you remember the N-Gage, Nokia's attempt at bringing together video games and mobile phones? If you don't worry about it. It's better off forgotten. During its ill-fated run, WWE did manage to make an appearance on it with Aftershock, an absolute joke of a game. Admittedly, we're talking about a handheld experience here, but there was literally nothing to do apart from have a basic match, and that was it. And it only had 11 wrestlers. Now, this wouldn't have been so bad if it played well, but it didn't. It was worse than Fandango. None of the controls were even remotely comfortable, and trying to play it on that tiny little screen was just impossible. This, straight up, was a bad game. Number 7. WWF Betrayal. Unless you have a really, really good idea, don't make a wrestling game not a wrestling game. It doesn't make sense to begin with. If you've got those 3 iconic letters slapped on the title, you'd imagine most people just want to wrestle. But alas, no. Other people have better ideas, and in 2001, WWF Betrayal came to the Game Boy Color. The premise? Stephanie McMahon had been kidnapped, and Vince charged you with getting her back. To do this, you had to walk through boring level after boring level, boringly punching generic enemies in the face over and over, and can you believe it? It was really boring. You did get to choose whether you were Triple H, The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, or The Undertaker though. But it didn't make a difference. At all. Ever. Number 6. WWE WrestleMania 21. In the mid-2000s, WWE decided you couldn't just have one game that was present across all consoles like we do today. You had to have individual ones specific to each. So the PlayStation had SmackDown, the GameCube had Day of Reckoning, and the Xbox had WrestleMania 21, which was terrible. While Studio Gigante deserves credit for actually starting afresh with the whole thing, it was genuinely built from the ground up. That also proved to be its undoing. WrestleMania 21 was littered with bugs and glitches that rendered it almost unplayable. The controls were all over the place, and 9 times out of 10, it had no idea whether you'd actually hit someone or not, which is pretty important in a game about hitting people. It looked great for the time, sure, such was the power of the Xbox, but everything else? Forget about it. Number 5. WWE Crush Hour. Not a wrestling game per se, but it was so bad I'm taking the opportunity to throw it into the mix. Released in 2003 for the PS2 and GameCube, WWE thought they were popular enough to just ignore wrestling altogether, again, and make a Demolition Derby clone. With over 30 superstars in their own custom cars, that also had guns, you drove around smashing into each other, but it was wetter than Seth Rollins' hair. Nothing felt impactful, and the whole time you were questioning, who is this for? Just didn't make any sense. When you discover what the plot for Crush Hour is, mind, there may be a hint at where this idea stemmed from. The concept, you see, is that this car-a-thon exists because Vince McMahon has finally taken control over all the television networks and can now do whatever he wants. So this was basically just Vince's fantasy played out in video game form. Number 4, WCW Mayhem. WCW vs NWO World Tour and Revenge are two of the finest wrestling games in history. This we know. Due to their success and rave reviews though, WWE quickly realised it wanted a piece of that pie, especially as in the late 90s they were paired with Acclaim, and if you want to see what happened to that studio, a quick Google will offer up literally dozens of stories. Seeing the way the world was turning, however, DHQ did jump ship to the Fed, leaving WCW feeling rather bemused. Deciding they didn't want to share a publisher with the competition, they switched over, signing with EA. The problem, however, was that no one at EA had ever made a wrestling game before. The first attempt was abysmal. Dubbed WCW Mayhem, it was horrendous to control, and at times it felt like a child had put it together. All the wrestlers had the same moves, meaning it didn't really matter who you picked, and it sometimes didn't even detect that you'd actually landed a blow. It sucked. Hands down. Number 3, Legends of Wrestling. On paper, Legends of Wrestling should have been one of the finest games in history. With a roster featuring every name any nostalgic fan could want, it even had Nikolai Volkov. Nikolai Volkov! This is where the highlights ended though. The game itself was incredibly slow and frankly dull. You couldn't really add any personality into a match, to the point after an hour of play, you started to realise all you were doing was the same thing over and over and over again. This hurt twice as hard for me, as I went to Dixon's and spent £50 on it because I was so desperate to play it. And I returned it the next day. Which is evidence enough. Number 2, The Simpsons Wrestling. See, what did I tell you? Wrestling's popularity wasn't all happiness and sunshine, because in 2001, we got The Simpsons Wrestling. Firstly, why and how do those two things go together? May as well have just made The Simpsons Tennis for as much sense as that makes. Secondly, good grief, this was bad. It genuinely is one of the worst looking games in history and will actually annoy you if you try to play it. It's near impossible to actually chain any kind of offense together, leaving you with only one option. Just mash the buttons. And even then it's pot luck. I feel sorry for anyone who bought this, be they a Simpsons or a wrestling fan. It's insulting. Number 1. WCW Backstage Assault. It's one thing to take pro wrestling and fit it into a different genre. It's another to screw with the core idea entirely. Unsurprisingly, WCW during its dying days were the people to do this when some smart aleck thought, F the ring, let's just set the whole thing in backstage brawls. Why this couldn't just have been an extra mode or, combined with actual wrestling matches is anyone's guess, and the game itself was a joke. Wrestlers glitched all over the place and the camera couldn't decide what it wanted to do. It jumped around more than Jeff Jarrett, which is a very bad and very untopical reference. I'm sorry about that. By this point, WCW's demise was all but confirmed, and Backstage Assault only sold 200,000 copies. That is bad. Know of any other terrible wrestling games? Let us know in the comments below, and then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can even come tell me on Twitter at SimonMiller316. I'm Simon from What Culture, and I'll chat to you again soon.